The year was 1842, and England stood between the candle and the machine, a nation half bound in lace, half chained in iron. Within that poised moment of progress and propriety stood Ashbourne Hall, a grand estate whose chandeliers still glittered though its coffers trembled. Tonight, beneath its painted ceilings, music drifted like perfume through the air as the widowed Duke of Ashbourne hosted a ball meant to remind the county that his house, though wounded, still reigned in grace. The Duke himself, Lord Henry Alastair Hawthorne, was a figure carved from restraint. At 37, he carried the solemn beauty of marble, proud brow, austere eyes, and a posture that revealed both command and fatigue. His first wife, Lady Clara, had been dead 3 winters, leaving behind whispers of tragedy and a son buried too young. Since then, the Duke's life had hardened into ceremony. Mornings of estate ledgers, evenings of silence, and a heart disciplined to stillness. Yet duty, that most persistent master, demanded he marry again. His choice, or rather society's for him, was Miss Eleanor Whitcomb, daughter of a Manchester industrialist. She was not born to manor halls, but to the scent of coal and the sound of looms. Raised in a household that valued industry over lineage, her father's wealth had bought her fine gowns and Tudors, yet her accent carried the faintest trace of the North, and her manners, though earnest, lacked the effortless choreography of the aristocracy. To the Duke, she was a transaction, a necessity for restoring financial stability and heirs. To Eleanor, he was a future as cold as it was glittering. As the violins played, she entered the ballroom in a gown of palest blue silk, the hue of early frost. Her hands trembled only slightly as she greeted the assembled guests, each curtsy performed with practiced grace. Conversations softened when she passed. Fans fluttered like restless wings. The gentlemen appraised her fortune, the ladies her pedigree. She smiled with the sincerity of someone who had learned that sincerity often failed to impress. The Duke approached her near the center of the room. His bow was measured, his words precisely polite. "You acquit yourself well, Miss Whitcomb," he said, his voice low enough that only she heard. "I have had good instruction, Your Grace," she replied, her tone steady despite the faint quiver in her breath. He inclined his head. "That will serve you. Appearances are the armor of our world." It was not affection, but acknowledgement, the kind a commander offers a soldier before battle. Eleanor nodded, though a small ache stirred within her. She was marrying a man of legend, yet already she felt invisible beside him. As the evening unfolded, the hall swelled with laughter and orchestral splendor. Yet beneath the glitter lay tension, that peculiar cruelty of English society which smiles while it wounds. During supper, Lady Pembroke, renowned for both her charm and malice, leaned toward Eleanor with a smile that glinted like glass. "My dear Miss Whitcomb," she cooed, "your gown is exquisite, so very modern. I dare say it must be from one of your father's mills." A ripple of laughter circled the table. Eleanor felt heat rise in her throat, but managed a gentle reply. "Indeed, my father's mills employ many fine hands. I'm glad their work meets your approval." The lady's smile faltered, but the damage was done. Eleanor's composure held, yet her appetite vanished. She sensed the Duke beside her, his expression unreadable. He said nothing in her defense. His silence was the most elegant betrayal of all. Later, as the orchestra began a waltz, he offered her his arm. She took it because duty required it, not because warmth invited her. They danced, flawlessly, wordlessly, the picture of marital promise. Yet his eyes did not meet hers. His touch guided, but did not connect. Around them, guests whispered admiration for their grace, mistaking precision for harmony. When the final notes faded, Eleanor excused herself to the terrace, where cool air bit through the tension clinging to her skin. The gardens stretched below, mist gathering among the statues. She exhaled, trying to release the night's humiliation, but tears threatened nonetheless. Behind her, laughter floated from the ballroom like distant bells, bright, unreachable. Through the glass doors, she saw the Duke speaking quietly with Lord Kendall, his oldest friend. His expression was calm, detached. The words drifted faintly into the night air, carried by chance or cruelty. "She is unpolished," the Duke said, his tone even, almost weary. "But she will learn her place. She is here for duty, not love." The world seemed to still around her. The sentence, delivered without malice, without hesitation, struck with the finality of a door closing. For a moment, Eleanor could neither move nor breathe. The cold bit at her bare shoulders, the music resumed, and yet she heard nothing but that one phrase looping through her mind. She turned away from the light, from the laughter, from the life she was expected to perform. Her reflection in the glass looked both fragile and resolute, as though two women warred behind her eyes, one wounded, one awakening. In the distance, the bells of Ashbourne village tolled the 11th hour. The night had turned, and so, quietly, had she. What began as a union of convenience had revealed its true cruelty, not lovelessness, but indifference. And in that indifference, Eleanor felt the first stirrings of something dangerous, the will to be seen, not merely kept. Inside, the Duke continued to play his part, offering polite farewells and measured smiles. He did not notice that his bride no longer watched him. She had already withdrawn into silence, the kind that grows roots. By the time the final guest departed and the chandeliers dimmed, the Duke retired believing the evening had been a success, the illusion of stability maintained. Yet upstairs, in a room that smelled faintly of roses and rain, Eleanor stood before her mirror and whispered the words back to herself, not with sorrow, but with a vow. "Here for duty," she said softly, her reflection unwavering. "Then let duty be my weapon." And somewhere deep within Ashbourne Hall, a long-forgotten clock began to chime, as though time itself had chosen that moment to wake. The weeks that followed their wedding passed with the precision of a calendar, but none of its warmth. The Duke of Ashbourne rose early, as was his custom, his footsteps measured and predictable along the marble halls. He spent his mornings in the study, surrounded by estate ledgers and the scent of old paper, and his afternoons inspecting tenants' lands or receiving men who bowed too deeply and spoke too little truth. His new duchess, meanwhile, inhabited a quieter existence, one defined by polite isolation. Eleanor dined when summoned, smiled when watched, and learned that in Ashbourne Hall, silence was the favored currency of survival. At first, she had tried to please him. She dressed as fashion dictated, greeted guests with the restraint expected of her rank, and memorized the names of every family tied to the estate. She wrote invitations in her fine, deliberate script, planned suppers with measured decorum, and attempted to match his stillness with her own. But her husband's distance was unyielding. His compliments, when they came, were like sunlight on winter stone, brief, cold, and distant. The Duke's conversation remained courteous yet impersonal, a collection of statements rather than confidences. He spoke of rents, weather, parliament, and lineage, never of himself. The servants had begun to sense her loneliness before she allowed herself to. Their eyes followed her with sympathy quickly masked by deference. She heard them whisper sometimes beyond the stairwell, their accents softened in caution. "Poor lady," one murmured. "She tries, she does." Another voice, older and resigned, replied, "He's been carved hollow since the old Duchess died. You can't fill a grave with kindness." The words lingered longer than she wished. One afternoon, while writing letters in the drawing room, Eleanor noticed a folded envelope upon the Duke's desk, sealed in blue wax. She had not meant to look, yet the handwriting, elegant and unmistakably feminine, caught her eye. When he entered moments later, her pulse betrayed her. "Post from London," he said evenly, noticing her glance. "A matter of estate business." He placed it within a drawer and turned the key. She nodded, pretending not to understand the tension that had entered the room. That night at dinner, he was unusually quiet, though his quiet was different, guarded rather than detached. Eleanor's curiosity sharpened into unease. The following day, a guest arrived, Lady Adeline Harcourt, recently widowed, known across the county for her beauty and composure. Her arrival required no introduction. The household seemed to breathe her name before she crossed the threshold. Eleanor received her with all civility, though a prickle of intuition moved through her like a shadow. Lady Adeline's manner was gracious, her smile impeccable, yet her gaze lingered on the Duke with the familiarity of memory. She spoke easily of old days, their shared hunts, the late Duchess's charitable works, summer spent at Bath. Her laughter-filled spaces Eleanor had never managed to warm. At dinner, she remarked lightly upon the changes in the household. New curtains in the dining room, Your Grace? I thought Lady Clara favored the old ones. Eleanor's fork paused mid-air. The Duke's expression did not change, yet his answer was faintly strained. These were the Duchess's choosing, he said, gesturing toward Eleanor. Lady Adeline inclined her head. A modern touch, she replied, her tone polite, her eyes unreadable. After the guests retired, Eleanor remained in the sitting room, the firelight dimming. The Duke entered to dismiss the servants, and for a rare moment they were alone. She turned toward him, her voice quiet but steady. You have known Lady Harcourt long. His reply came without hesitation. She was my wife's closest friend. Her presence comforts what time cannot. Eleanor met his gaze. And what of your comfort, my lord? Does she serve that purpose too? For the first time, his composure faltered. You mistake friendship for sentiment, he said sharply. Do not let gossip corrupt your sense. I have no gossip, she said softly. Only observation. Their eyes held for a moment too long, the air between them charged with what neither dared name. Then he turned away, his voice curt. You will remember your station, Eleanor. Appearances sustain us. When he left, the room felt smaller, as though the very walls absorbed the sting of his dismissal. That night, she sat by her window, watching snow gather along the terrace, thinking of the letter locked in his desk. For the first time, she wondered whether her dignity had become a kind of prison. In the days that followed, Lady Adeline departed, but her absence was as present as her company. Servants whispered again. Rumors drifted through the neighboring estates that the Duke's heart remained elsewhere. Eleanor smiled at them when required, played her role to perfection, yet a new resolve stirred beneath her calm. She would not be the ghost that haunted his household. She would become its pulse. It was then she found her first ally in the quiet rhythm of the servants' wing. Mrs. Briggs, the old cook who had served the Duke's family for 3 generations. The woman's hands were worn but sure, her eyes bright with wit dulled by years of deference. When Eleanor entered the kitchen unannounced, a scandalous act for a duchess, the staff froze in alarm. Carry on, she said gently. I'm merely curious. Mrs. Briggs hesitated, then smiled. Curious folk are often kind folk, Your Grace. The old Duchess used to come here too. Eleanor's interest stirred. Did she? And what did she do? She listened. The cook replied simply. Then, after a pause, she added, and she cooked. That evening, Eleanor sat by the fire in her chamber, the memory of the kitchen's warmth softening her mood. She had learned something essential. The late Duchess had been loved not for her title, but her humanity. It was a kind of power no etiquette could teach. As the fire crackled, Eleanor resolved to understand this place not through its grandeur, but its people. Down the corridor, the Duke paced alone in his study, the sealed letters stacked neatly before him. He paused once, as though he could hear the faint echo of laughter rising from below stairs, then dismissed the thought with a sigh. Duty had always demanded distance, yet for the first time it felt like exile. Outside, snow began to fall, blanketing the estate in a hush that seemed almost expectant. Within that silence, the balance between them shifted, imperceptibly, but enough to change the air. And though neither yet knew it, the first thaw had already begun. Rain had claimed Ashbourne for 3 unbroken days, drumming against the leaded windows with the patience of sorrow. The skies hung low and colorless, pressing their melancholy upon the estate until even the portraits seemed to fade. On the 3rd morning, the Duke rode out to survey the tenant lands despite the storm, defying the steward's pleas. By nightfall he returned drenched, his horse limping, his breath ragged with chill. Within hours, a fever took hold. The house fell into anxious motion. Servants whispered in corridors, and candles burned through the night outside his chamber. Eleanor heard of his condition before dawn and went to him without hesitation. Protocol demanded she summon a physician, but instinct commanded her nearer. The Duke lay pale beneath the canopy bed, his composure stripped away by exhaustion. His breath came shallow, his brow glistened with fever. The doctor, called in haste from the village, muttered of inflammation and advised rest. When he departed, the Duchess remained at his bedside, dismissing the attendants with a quiet authority that surprised even herself. Through the long hours she sat vigil, changing his cloths, whispering reassurances he was too far gone to hear. She read aloud from the Psalms, not out of piety, but from a wish to steady her own trembling heart. Between verses she studied him. The stern line of his jaw softened in weakness, the vulnerability that illness had pried from the armor of his restraint. She realized then that she had never truly seen him, only the performance of him. Beneath his discipline, there was a man who carried grief like a second skin, and for the first time she pitied him rather than resented him. When he woke near midnight, confusion clouded his gaze. "Clara," he murmured, the name slipping like a ghost from his lips. The sound struck her, not with jealousy, but with understanding. He was lost somewhere between memory and fever, calling to a woman buried by time. "No," she said softly, dipping the cloth again. "It is Eleanor. You're home." He blinked, his eyes unfocused. "Home," he repeated, as though the word itself had become foreign. She smiled faintly, unsure if he truly heard. Yet in that moment, she decided she would make it true again, for him and for herself. By morning, the fever had worsened. Rain continued to fall, the house echoing with the quiet panic of suppressed fear. Eleanor refused to leave his side. She ordered broth to be prepared, sent for herbs, and kept the fire burning high. When Mrs. Briggs entered with a tray, she hesitated upon seeing the Duchess in her husband's chair. "Beg pardon, Your Grace," she said, "but you ought to rest." "I shall, when he does," Eleanor replied. Her tone was calm, though her hands trembled from fatigue. Mrs. Briggs lingered, setting down the tray. "He's stubborn, the Duke is. Always has been. But he listens when one speaks plain." Eleanor smiled faintly. "Then I must learn to speak so." The cook's eyes softened. "You already do." That evening, as twilight deepened, Eleanor coaxed him to take a few spoonfuls of broth. He obeyed without protest, his gaze fixed on her as though searching for the reason she remained. When she turned to adjust the fire, his voice came weak but clear. "You need not attend me so closely." She looked back at him, her expression steady. "And yet here I am, my lord. Not for duty, but because no one else would dare." For a heartbeat he seemed to study her as though seeing her anew, but exhaustion soon reclaimed him. Still, the faintest smile lingered on his lips as he drifted into sleep. 2 days passed. His fever broke with the dawn, leaving him pale but conscious. Eleanor, who had scarcely slept, felt both relief and weariness descend like a tide. When he woke, she was reading by the hearth, her hair unpinned, her gown creased. Imperfections unthinkable a fortnight ago. He watched her for a long moment before speaking. "I am indebted to you," he said quietly. She closed the book, meeting his gaze. "You owe me nothing." "Then why stay?" "Because it is lonely to fight the dark alone," she replied. He turned his face toward the fire, and in that gesture she sensed something within him soften, a surrender not to her, but to his own humanity. When he had gained strength enough to walk, she insisted on accompanying him downstairs. The household watched with discreet astonishment as the Duke leaned upon her arm, his step uncertain yet unashamed. For once, he did not care who saw his weakness. He took a seat by the hearth while she busied herself nearby, the rhythm of domestic life slowly returning. That afternoon, while the rain eased to a mist, Eleanor ventured into the kitchen again. Mrs. Briggs greeted her with a knowing smile. "You've done what no doctor could, Your Grace. You've given him reason to eat again." Eleanor laughed softly, though her eyes glistened. Then I must find something worth eating. The cook's gaze turned thoughtful. There was one dish he favored as a boy. His mother's stew. Simple, but it warmed the soul. He hasn't touched it since she passed. Eleanor hesitated only a moment before nodding. Teach me. They worked together through the evening, the scent of simmering marrow and thyme filling the kitchen. Eleanor moved carefully, following each instruction, her hands steady with purpose. When at last the stew was done, she carried it herself to the Duke's chamber, the bowl trembling slightly in her grasp. He looked up as she entered, surprise flickering in his expression. "You cooked this?" "With help," she admitted. Mrs. Briggs remembered the recipe. He accepted the spoon she offered, tasted, and stilled. The expression that crossed his face was not mere pleasure, but recognition, a memory reclaimed. "My mother used to make this," he said quietly. "So I was told." Silence lingered between them, tender and heavy. Then he looked at her with something approaching awe. "How did you know what would reach me?" Eleanor's voice was soft but unwavering. "Kindness has a way of finding the places pride cannot." He said nothing more, but his eyes remained on her long after she turned to leave. Outside, the rain ceased entirely, and a fragile light broke through the clouds. It touched the windows of Ashbourne Hall like a benediction, quiet and unmistakable. By morning, rumor would whisper through the house that the Duke had smiled again, and that the Duchess had been the cause. Winter laid its quiet claim upon Ashbourne. Snow pressed against the tall windows like breath upon glass, muting the world in shades of silver and pearl. Within the hall, fires burned steadily, and yet a gentler warmth had begun to take root, one that had nothing to do with the hearth. The Duke had recovered, though the convalescence had left its mark. His manner, once guarded by formality, had softened into something contemplative. He still spoke with the precision of habit, but there were pauses now, moments in which he seemed to measure his words against feeling rather than propriety. Eleanor, too, had changed. The shadows beneath her eyes spoke of long nights and quiet endurance. But there was a serenity in her gaze, a strength born of having crossed an invisible threshold. The household felt it as well. The servants, once cautious in her presence, now greeted her with quiet affection. Laughter returned to corridors that had long forgotten it. And though society at large might still have regarded her as a merchant's daughter wearing a duchess's crown, within Ashbourne she had begun to command something rarer than respect: devotion. It did not go unnoticed beyond the gates. Rumors, like frost, crept through drawing rooms in London. Whispers that the Duke had grown sentimental, that his common-born wife held too much sway over him. Invitations to court dwindled. Old acquaintances, those who once filled his tables, found reasons to remain in town. Yet Henry did not seem to mourn their absence. On the contrary, the quiet suited him. The only disturbance to that calm came one morning with the arrival of a familiar visitor, Lady Adeline Harcourt. She arrived cloaked in mourning gray, her expression a mask of courtesy. The Duchess received her with impeccable composure, offering tea and polite conversation. The Duke joined them only briefly, his countenance reserved. Adeline spoke of London, of Parliament's chatter, of the Queen's latest charity, and finally, of rumor. "They say, my lord," she said delicately, "that your attentions to your new Duchess have altered your standing. You have always been admired for your sense of measure. It would grieve me to see that reputation diminished." The Duke regarded her steadily. "And yet here I stand, quite unaltered," he replied. "Forgive me," she continued, lowering her voice, "but affection is a dangerous indulgence in our circles. The heart, when made public, invites the world's amusement." Before Eleanor could respond, Henry's tone shifted, gentle yet resolute. "Then let them laugh, Adeline. I have endured far worse than laughter. If affection has made me their jest, so be it. I have tired of living for the approval of those who mistake coldness for dignity." Lady Harcourt faltered, her composure slipping just enough for truth to show. She rose gracefully, murmured some excuse of pressing business, and departed before dusk. When the carriage wheels vanished into the snow, Eleanor turned to her husband. "You needn't have said that for my sake." "I said it for mine," he answered quietly. For years, I have hidden behind a title, believing it would shelter what I fear to feel. But a house without warmth is only a tomb with better furnishing. Her gaze met his, steady and luminous. Then let it live again. That night marked the first Christmas Eve since tragedy had silenced the estate. The hall glowed with candlelight and evergreen garlands. The Duke's tenants, invited at Eleanor's insistence, filled the air with humble gratitude and shy laughter. She moved among them with effortless grace, speaking to each by name, remembering their children, their ailments, their small triumphs. The Duke watched from across the room, all gathering quietly behind his calm exterior. For the first time, he saw not the outsider he had married, but the heart that had mended what centuries of pride had frayed. When the guests departed, he found her in the great gallery, gazing at the portraits of his ancestors. The firelight played across her features, and something within him stirred. Recognition, long delayed yet undeniable. He approached, holding a small wooden box. "This belonged to my mother," he said, offering it to her. Inside, nestled in velvet, lay a locket restored to brightness, its clasp newly repaired. It was lost for years. The steward found it among the old nursery things. Eleanor traced the miniature within, a woman's painted face smiling gently, her eyes alive with kindness. "She looks as though she understood happiness," she murmured. "She did," Henry replied, "and I think she would have liked you." She closed the locket and pressed it into his palm. "Then keep it, my lord. She is part of you, and I would not take what already belongs to your heart." He looked at her for a long moment before speaking. "Eleanor, you were brought here by necessity, and I, God forgive me, saw you as nothing more than that. But you have given this house what no fortune could restore. You have given it peace." Her breath caught. "Peace is not mine to give," she whispered. "It's something found between two who stop pretending they do not need it." His hand closed around hers. The gesture was simple, yet it felt like a vow. In that clasp lay every word their decorum had forbidden. For a long while they stood there, framed by firelight and silence, two figures bound not by contract but by recognition. Later, before the embers died, he turned to her once more. "You came to me for duty," he said, his voice low, "but you have shown me something nobler. You reminded me I was human." Outside, the bells from Ashbourne village tolled midnight, their chimes scattering into the cold like blessings. Snow continued to fall, soft and endless, veiling the world in purity. Within the hall, the Duke drew his wife's hand to his lips, the gesture tender and unhurried. History would not record their names beyond lineage charts and estate ledgers. But in that quiet hour, love, unremarked, unsanctioned, entirely human, had taken its rightful place among the great pillars of Ashbourne. And though the snow would melt, the house would never again feel cold. When dawn came, the first light touched the frost-laced windows, and the estate awoke to laughter in its halls. For those who passed years later, hearing tales of the Duke and his unlikely Duchess, the story was told simply. She taught him to live again, and he, in turn, learned that gentleness could bear the weight of a crown. The rest, as all true love stories do, lived quietly, beyond the reach of society's gaze, but forever within the heart's record.